Number 13. Sarah Louise McGill. Scottish hypnotherapist Sarah Louise McGill was probably expecting a relaxing vacation when she traveled to Florida in April 2018, but that's not what she got. Instead of getting some much-needed R&R, she ended up in the slammer. According to the Orange County Sheriff's Office, the 28-year-old was busted for taking $480 from an underage young man in exchange for intercourse. McGill and the victim initially connected on a question-and-answer platform called Quora, where she went by the name Sophia Bell. They began texting back and forth and eventually agreed to meet face-to-face at a Marriott hotel, where they made their agreed-upon exchange. Afterward, the boy felt guilty about the tryst and told his father, who took him straight down to the police station to report McGill. When asked about why he met up with McGill, the teen said he had become bored with his life and wanted to spice things up. Regardless of what his motivation was, he was not responsible for what happened. McGill was, and deputies were happy to pay a visit to her hotel room, where they found her with another client. Inside the room's safe, they found protection, used protection wrappers, and a large amount of cash, making it pretty clear that companionship was a business to McGill. Terrified at the thought of going to jail, she begged the police to let her off with a slap on the wrist. She initially claimed that she and the boy were just talking when one thing led to another, but the cops knew better. McGill eventually admitted that she was a prostitute. And while she claimed that the teen told her he was over 18, she conceded that he did not look that old. She continued pleading for leniency, insisting that she did not have bad intentions, that she didn't know what happened, and that she was a down-to-earth, normal person. The terrified courtesan even volunteered to leave the country if it meant avoiding jail, but she did not get her wish. McGill was booked into custody for lewd and lascivious battery, and she was probably relieved to learn that bonding out was an option and that she wasn't going to be stuck in an American jail forever. But she was required to hand over her passport to ensure that she would remain in the US until she squared away her legal charge, which carries a maximum sentence of 15 years in prison. McGill was convicted of the crime, but the judge spared her from prison and instead sentenced her to 5 years of probation. She never ended up having to serve the probation because she was deported from the US, which effectively terminated her supervision. It's unclear whether she's allowed to ever come back to America, but if she ever returns, it's probably safe to assume that she won't repeat her past mistakes. Number 12. Madeline Joan Lewin. 52-year-old Australian businessman Anthony Brady vanished in August of 2020 during a work trip in Cairns. His family reported him missing after he failed to catch his flight home. Police began combing the area surrounding the gas station where he was last seen, with a 32-year-old prostitute named Madeline Joan Lewin. The findings led investigators to a nearby hotel room where they found Brady face down with his hands and ankles tied to the bed. He was wearing a hood, had a rope around his neck, and had a gag in his mouth, which would have made it difficult for him to breathe. The medical examiner who performed Brady's autopsy listed 3 possible causes of death, but detectives surmised that Lewin would have noticed at some point that he had stopped moving. At the very least, she should have known that Brady's restraints needed to be loosened, and at some point his condition would have deteriorated to the point where he needed medical help. To investigators, it meant that Lewin had plenty of time to prevent Brady's death, but chose not to, turning what began as a consensual bondage game into a death trap. It would later be revealed in court that Lewin was on parole when the tragedy occurred. Her life had started to spiral out of control in 2018, and her family noticed in 2019 that her behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. During that same year, she was convicted of carjacking and assaulting police officers and was sentenced to 16 months in prison. Unfortunately, her time behind bars failed to help her get her life back on track, and her downward spiral continued following her release. In 2022, Lewin was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. It took the jury just a half hour to find her guilty, and the judge minced no words while handing down the punishment. He described Lewin as remorseless and having a self-indulgent disregard for Brady's safety. The judge also admonished her for never fully revealing exactly what happened on the day of Brady's death, which would have answered the lingering questions that continue to surround the tragedy. Number 11. Vancouver's missing women. The women in today's next listing didn't do anything to deserve what happened to them, but are a tragic example of the terrible things that can happen in this very risky line of work. In the early 1980s, Vancouver, Canada's downtown east side, was the country's poorest neighborhood. During that time, prostitutes and other vulnerable women, many of them Indigenous, First Nations, began vanishing from the area. One of the first ladies to go missing was 23-year-old Rebecca Guno, who, like many others, sold her body to support her drug addiction. Also, like many of the 60-plus women who disappeared over a 20-year period, she was never found. For years, investigators had no idea why women were vanishing from the downtown east side or who was responsible for it. Their first major breakthrough came in 2002 when federal law enforcement raided a rundown pig farm belonging to a man named Robert Willie Picton. They were searching for illegal guns at the property, which was located roughly 20 miles outside Vancouver, but began finding the missing women's belongings. The cops also uncovered human remains, including body parts in a freezer and mixed in with pig feed. Over the years, various tipsters had told the police to investigate Picton's farm in connection with the disappearances. These suggestions had fallen on deaf ears, even after a prostitute named Wendy Lynn Eistetter survived a brutal stabbing at Picton's hands in 1997. It was largely ignored despite the property's reputation as a party haven for gangsters, drug dealers, and working girls. Law enforcement also either ignored or failed to notice that Picton was a regular customer of Vancouver's prostitutes and that women often failed to reappear after going to party at his farm. Picton was charged with attempted murder after the attack on Wendy, but the case was dropped and police continued to turn a blind eye to the goings-on at the pig farm. After the first gruesome discoveries were made in 2002, investigators spent 2 years going over the property with a fine-toothed comb. Through DNA evidence, they identified the partial remains of dozens of women. Prosecutors initially charged Picton with 26 counts of first-degree murder, but trying him on all of the charges would have been extremely expensive and time-consuming. They ultimately took 6 of the murder charges to trial for the deaths of 24-year-old Marnie Lee Ann Frey, who disappeared in 1997, 32-year-old Brenda Ann Wolfe, and 34-year-old Georgina Faith Papin, who vanished in 1999, and 22-year-old Andrea Josbury, 26-year-old Mona Lee Wilson, and 29-year-old Serena Abbotsway, who all went missing in 2001. In 2007, the jury found Picton guilty of 6 lesser counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to the maximum of 25 years to life, and in early 2024, he became eligible for day parole, despite being Canada's most prolific serial killer. The true number of Picton's victims may never be known, but he eventually admitted to killing 49 women. Many people believe Picton should only leave prison when he's dead. Some experts have speculated that this may end up being the case, considering the enormity of his crimes and the likelihood that the parole board will deny his release. But the possibility of Picton regaining his freedom and the uncertainty that comes with it are enough for his victims' families to feel let down by the justice system, which is completely understandable. For now, all they can do is hope that Picton never sees the light of day outside prison walls. Number 10. Edwin Falkner and Juan Carlos Martinez Herrera. In a senseless act of violence that cut an innocent man's life short in March 2012, a 57-year-old florist named John Lawback was murdered in his own apartment in Manhattan's Chelsea neighborhood. He had been asphyxiated to death and was found tied to a bedpost with an electrical cord. Investigators traced the crime to 33-year-old Edwin Falkner and 35-year-old Juan Carlos Martinez Herrera, who knew Lawback through their work as prostitutes. Lawback was a regular customer of both suspects, who claimed that he died accidentally during a rough bondage session. Prosecutors didn't buy the story, especially since Falkner and Martinez Herrera had ransacked Lawback's apartment and were caught on video trying to use his ATM card. And both men had criminal records, so they were clearly not above deliberately breaking the law. The suspects were also not very well liked among Lawback's friends, including Steve Kopf, who described Falkner as a soulless drone and Martinez Herrera as a manipulative, self-serving, greedy little bee during an interview with the New York Post. All things considered, the story about Lawback supposedly dying during a kinky encounter gone wrong was not very believable, but the defendants clung stubbornly to their claims of innocence throughout their trial, hoping the jury would be sold on their not very convincing explanation of what had happened. Taking the stand in his own defense, Martinez Herrera claimed that Laubach began turning blue and purple while performing a certain act on him. He accused his co-defendant Falkner of telling him to leave Laubach's lifeless body tied to the bed because the authorities wouldn't believe that it was an accident otherwise. Martinez Herrera also said that he and Falkner only stole things from Laubach's home in an attempt to stage the crime scene as a burglary. He apparently wasn't thinking about the fact that when you enter someone's home and take things, you are burglarizing it, regardless of what your reasons are for doing it. After deliberating for less than a day, the jury found both men guilty of murder, kidnapping, and robbery. They were each sentenced to 25 years to life, ensuring that they won't be free to harm any more innocent victims anytime in the near future. Number 9. The West Mesa Murders. A New Mexico woman was walking her dog on the West Mesa of Albuquerque in early 2009 when she discovered human bones scattered in the dirt. The remains belonged to a 22-year-old mother of two named Michelle Valdez, who had vanished 5 years earlier when she was 4 months pregnant with her third child. Michelle was working as a prostitute in a notorious community of housing projects known as the War Zone when she was last seen alive. Sadly, the only people to notice her disappearance were her parents, who she was estranged from, and the group of fellow escorts that she hustled the streets with. During a search of the area where Michelle's bones were found, police uncovered the remains of 11 more missing women, most of whom were of Hispanic origin and worked as escorts prior to their disappearances. Sylvania Edwards ran away from Oklahoma as a teenager in 2003 and was last seen in the company of 3 other escorts in April 2004. 27-year-old Evelyn Salazar and her teenage cousin Jamie Barrella vanished that same month after being last seen at a family gathering. 24-year-old Doreen Marquez and 22-year-old Monica Candelaria were killed sometime between 2003 and 2005. 24-year-old Virginia Cloven, 32-year-old Cinnamon Elks, 24-year-old Julie Nieto, 26-year-old Victoria Chavez, and 28-year-old Veronica Romero were murdered between 2004 and 2005. Much like Michelle Valdez, many of these women had been lost to the streets by the time they went missing. Most of them had families who loved them and were looking for them, but were receiving little to no help from law enforcement with their searches. In some cases, loved ones phoned in tips that went overlooked. Relatives often waited months to hear back from detectives, causing them to feel like the authorities placed a low value on the lives of women who struggled with addiction and worked as prostitutes. Following the discovery of the women's remains, the police chief at the time, Ray Schultz, denied that the cases were ignored. Whether or not he was telling the truth may never be known, and more than 15 years later, the murders also remain shrouded in mystery. No arrests have ever been made, and investigators continue to appeal to the public for tips in hopes that someone will come forward with information that can help break the case. A $100,000 reward is being offered for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the killer or killers. Number 8. Alicia Walker. It may never be clear exactly what happened between 22-year-old Alicia Walker, a fellow escort, and their client, 61-year-old Catholic school teacher Alan Fillon, in early 2014. Prior to the fateful meeting at Fillon's home in the Chicago suburb of Orlando Park, Walker described Fillon as a really good trick. She had met him twice before and expected the encounter to go smoothly, as it had during their previous meetings. But something went terribly wrong behind closed doors, and Fillon ended up dead on his kitchen floor with multiple defensive and stab wounds. During his final moments, he suffered injuries to his heart, liver, kidney, and spleen. Neither of the women called 911 before fleeing the scene, but Walker was identified as the prime suspect in the case. A few days after Fillon's death, police picked her up at a motel in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where she was staying. She allegedly played dumb at first, but decided she was ready to talk after being grilled for 5 hours. Alicia admitted to stabbing Fillon, but insisted she had acted in self-defense. Investigators didn't buy her story, and she was charged with first-degree murder. During her trial, Walker claimed that Fillon flew into a rage and charged at her with a knife when she and her friend refused to forego protection during intimacy. Her defense attorney, Patrick O'Byrne, argued that his client had defensive injuries, including cuts and a broken nail. He also got down on the floor and dramatically acted out what he believed happened between Fillon and Walker. Prosecutors, on the other hand, theorized that Fillon had gotten upset when the escort who accompanied Walker to the date wasn't the same woman featured in her online ad. Describing Walker as a master manipulator, Assistant State's Attorneys James Papa and Krista Bowden speculated that Phelan refused to pay the girls and that Walker was intent on leaving the residence with the payment the parties had originally agreed upon. O'Byrne disputed the prosecution's version of events, arguing that if Walker wanted money, she didn't have to stab Phelan. She had to do what she originally came there to do and provide Phelan with her services. In early 2016, a jury found her guilty of a lesser second-degree murder charge. Walker was devastated by the verdict, even though a first-degree murder charge would have come with a potentially much harsher sentence. But Alicia was adamant about her innocence and didn't believe the prosecution gave her a fair shake, so any conviction period and any time behind bars felt like an injustice. She's currently serving a 15-year sentence, but continues fighting to clear her name. Number 7. Manuel Benitez. Just days before Christmas in 2015, a respected 75-year-old psychiatrist was strangled to death inside a Philadelphia hotel room near his office. An employee found Dr. Howard Baker's deceased naked body after he failed to check out as planned. He had a belt wrapped tightly around his neck, leading to initial speculation that he had died in some sort of kinky game gone wrong, but the medical examiner ruled that he was deliberately strangled and classified his death as a homicide. Baker's murder came as a shock to his wife, who said her husband had told her that he was watching a sports game at a bar. She had no idea he was at a seedy hotel or what he had been doing there, but the shocking truth soon came out. Surveillance footage from the previous day showed Baker leaving the hotel room twice and returning with a different man each time. The second visitor was seen leaving the room after midnight with the doctor's backpack and wallet. Investigators identified the suspect as 27-year-old Manuel Benitez, a homeless prostitute who had previously lived in nearby Allentown and Bethlehem. He had a lengthy rap sheet consisting of dozens of charges and convictions. His previous offenses included assault, prowling, making terroristic threats, and drug possession. Benitez was serving a 3-year probation sentence and had been sprung loose from county lockup just a month before the murder after pleading guilty to several drug-related crimes, leading to criticisms that the authorities could have, and obviously should have, kept him in custody. He was also awaiting trial on a disorderly conduct charge at the time of Baker's murder. In some cases, Benitez had avoided prison thanks to luck, including at least one occasion when a witness who was slated to testify against him failed to appear in court. But it's hard to understand how he remained free after being arrested 7 times on suspicion of 18 charges in the 9 months leading up to Baker's death. While the outcome of the murder case against Benitez is unclear, records show that he's currently locked up at a Pennsylvania state prison. Number 6. Angel Weston and Stephanie Folk. When 40-year-old Frank Zarzicki met up with 21-year-old Angel Weston and 22-year-old Stephanie Folk in Philadelphia in 2013, he expected to throw them some cash in exchange for a fun time. Instead, he vanished, prompting his concerned family to report him missing. About a week later, a fisherman found Zarzicki's mutilated torso floating in a garbage bag in the Schuylkill River. His head, arms, and legs had been severed and were nowhere in sight. Investigators were able to identify the torso as Zarzicki based on a distinctive chest tattoo, and they traced the crime to Weston and Folk through his electronic devices. Folk would later testify that Zarzicki was high-strung and jittery when he arrived at the apartment. He was obviously high on something and was preparing to do more drugs when the women's pimp, 34-year-old Keith King Talbot, barged into the room and tried to rob him. Zarzicki fought back and ended up face down on the floor while Talbot beat him and the women tied him up and tased him. He began screaming that he couldn't breathe and became unresponsive, which wasn't part of the plan. Using the skills he had learned in nursing school, Talbot immediately began performing CPR on Zarzicki, but was unable to resuscitate him. Zarzicki died from his injuries and the panicked suspects dragged him into the bathroom where Talbot dismembered him with a hatchet. According to investigators, the apartment belonged to Talbot. It was part of a low-income housing development and he only paid $30 per month in rent. He also earned money as a pimp, and while Zarzicki was known to carry large amounts of cash and drugs, it's hard to understand why Talbot resorted to deadly violence. Talbot, Weston, and Folk were initially charged with robbery and murder. In exchange exchange for her testimony, Folk pleaded guilty to robbery and conspiracy. The murder charge against her was dropped, and she was sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison, followed by 2.5 years of probation. Weston pleaded guilty to the same charges and received the same sentence. Talbot also took a deal and pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, conspiracy to commit robbery, and abuse of corpse in exchange for a 22 to 44-year prison term. Number 5. Jerry Pagan. On a Saturday night in December 2016, a 68-year-old Bronx man named Richard Reed was found dead in his bathtub at his Concourse Village apartment. His homeless lover, 32-year-old Jerry Pagan, had allegedly bludgeoned him in the head with a hammer, stabbed him with a pair of scissors, and cut off his privates, following a heated argument about his expectations of financial support in exchange for his companionship. Pagan reportedly told investigators that the couple had engaged in unprotected intimacy a few days earlier. He wanted to get tested for STDs, but Reed refused to give him the money he needed to cover the cost of the tests, prompting him to show up at the victim's apartment in a rage. The accused killer confessed to his crimes in disturbing detail. He described how he removed Reed's private part and placed it in the sink with plans to fry it and eat it while his older lover bled to death. Pagan also told the police that he wanted to cut Reed's head off and throw it into a nearby river, but law enforcement caught up with him before he could follow through with these horrifying plans. Reed and Pagan had known each other for years, according to police, who arrested the accused killer on suspicion of second-degree murder and manslaughter. Pagan pleaded not guilty to the charges and was held without bail pending the outcome of his case. Curiously, there have been no updates on the case since the story first broke. Records show that Pagan is not currently in state prison, but given the nature of the crime, it's also unlikely that he's living in the free world. Considering the circumstances surrounding the murder, it's possible that Pagan was found mentally incompetent and is perhaps being treated at a psychiatric hospital. Number 4. Mark Anthony Skeet. In June of 2014, 33-year-old Jamar Clark was found murdered at his apartment in Newport News, Virginia. He had been shot multiple times at close range and left to die in a pool of blood on his kitchen floor. Another local resident, 36-year-old James Arthur Miller Jr., was found slumped over his steering wheel the following month. He had been shot in the back of the head during a robbery gone wrong. According to investigators, the attacker had most likely decided to pull the trigger when Miller put up a tougher fight than they had expected. The murders of Clark and Miller went unsolved for 6 years. Finally, in 2020, federal authorities announced the arrest of 34-year-old Mark Anthony Skeet for both murders. According to prosecutors, the killings came after Skeet and 3 women began running a prostitution ring in Newport News in 2014. On the day of Clark's death, one of the women was sent to his apartment to provide her services. Clark was either unwilling or unable to pay, so the woman called Skeet and asked what she should do. As a leader of the New York City-based 9 Trey Gangsters criminal enterprise, Skeet had a powerful image to uphold if he wanted his subordinates to take him seriously. After consulting with a fellow gang leader in New York, he went to Clark's apartment and gunned him down in cold blood, setting the example that nobody was going to get away with refusing to pay his girls. Afterward, it was back to business as usual. Skeet and the women continued hustling, then fled the area the next morning. He murdered Miller the following month after arranging to meet him for a drug buy with no actual plans to pay for the goods. After shooting Miller execution style, Skeet gathered up the victim's cash, phone, and drugs, then fled the scene. When Skeet was finally arrested for the murders, he was already serving a 75-year sentence for killing a Richmond couple the month after he killed Miller. In September 2014, he had fatally shot Sequenta Dixon and Andrea Todd in the parking lot of their apartment building. Later that month, he injured 2 men in yet another shooting. Skeet was arrested for the murders of Dixon and Todd and the non-fatal shooting 2 months later and was found guilty of those crimes. After his arrest in 2020, Skeet was potentially facing the death penalty if convicted as charged. In exchange for having capital punishment taken off the table, he pleaded guilty to the murders of Clark and Miller in federal court. His defense attorneys tried persuading the judge to give him a sentence that would come with the possibility of seeing freedom again someday. They also urged the court to consider Skeet for geriatric parole, which would come with the possibility of being released if he experiences health issues during old age. Skeet's lawyers argued that his extremely difficult upbringing had affected his maladjusted and violent behavior. He was subjected to neglect and trauma at a very early age, and his father was sentenced to life in prison during his childhood for arson and a gang-related murder. The attorneys claimed that with proper mental health treatment, medication, and anger management, Skeet could outgrow his criminal tendencies. Skeet expressed deep remorse for his actions and the pain he caused to his victims and their families. He said he wanted to do something good with his life, become a respected member of his community, and reconnect with his son. One of his major goals was to prevent his son and others from going down the same path that both he and his father had taken. Skeet was probably being genuine. It at least sounded like he was. And it's certainly understandable that he wants to break the cycle of violence that has clearly been passed down from one generation to the next in his family. But it's practically unheard of for someone to ever see freedom again after murdering 4 people in cold blood. And while Skeet hoped to be an exception, he did not get his wish. In the words of the judge, there was simply way too much in Skeet's criminal and personal past to overcome. Skeet was sentenced to 2 life terms and will remain in prison until his dying day. It's unclear whether the prostitutes who allegedly acted as Skeet's accomplices were ever charged for their roles in the crimes. Number 3. Alix Catherine Tishelman. 51-year-old Google executive Forrest Timothy Hayes was known to most of the people in his life as a straight-laced father of 5 and devoted family man and husband. He became a multimillionaire after starting his career in his home state of Michigan and eventually relocated to Santa Cruz, California, where he provided his wife and kids with a very comfortable lifestyle. But there was another side to Hayes, one that his family and even his friends were unaware of. So it came as a complete shock to his loved ones when he was found dead on his yacht from a heroin overdose in the fall of 2013. Nobody could picture Hayes using hard drugs, let alone hanging around with anyone who used them. But there was no denying what happened, and in their quest for answers, investigators traced the deceased businessman's last interactions to 26-year-old Alix Tishelman, who had connected with Hayes on a sugar daddy dating website shortly before his death. Hayes had recently paid Tishelman $3,000 to meet her for lunch. The meeting went well, and they made plans to party on his yacht at a later date. Surveillance footage from the evening of Forrest's death revealed that Tishelman had been on his boat. In the video, Hayes could be seen losing consciousness and having a seizure. Seemingly unfazed by the medical emergency that was unfolding before her eyes, Tishelman calmly finished her glass of wine, stepped over Hayes, and left the scene. Best case scenario, prosecutors believed she had knowingly failed to call for help, while Hayes convulsed and died right in front of her. 8 months after the tragedy, an undercover cop lured Tishelman to her arrest by posing as a potential sugar daddy. During questioning, she insisted that she left the yacht in a panic, even though she didn't seem to be upset or in a hurry in the security video. She claimed that she failed to seek medical help for Hayes because she didn't want him to get in trouble with his wife, and because she was also high on heroin and wasn't thinking straight. Tishelman eventually pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter, prostitution, drug possession, and destroying evidence. She served 2 years of a 6-year prison sentence, using her time behind bars to get sober and straighten out her own life. Following her release in 2017, she was deported back to Canada, where she found a fulfilling career working with other recovering addicts. Tishelman was looking forward to her future when her life unexpectedly took another bad turn in 2018. This time she was accused of her former boyfriend, 53-year-old Dean Riopelle, who fatally overdosed in his home outside Atlanta 2 months before Hayes' death. After learning of her involvement in the fatal overdose that killed Hayes, investigators in Georgia took a second look at Riopelle's death, which until then had been classified as an accidental overdose. Prosecutors accused Tishelman of injecting Riopelle with heroin when he was passed out drunk, and authorities announced their plans to begin the process of extraditing her to Georgia. There have been no updates since July of 2018, leaving the current status of the case unclear. Number 2. Jose Manuel Ramirez. 27-year-old Phoenix-based flight attendant Nick Aronson had his entire future ahead of him when his life was cruelly ripped away from him in Mexico City in October 2011. Police discovered his murdered body at around 4:30 a.m. after being called to a Hilton hotel where Aronson was staying during a layover. His co-workers had asked for a welfare check after he failed to report for work as scheduled. Aronson was found face down with his hands bound behind his back. He had been strangled to death with his own belt and struck several times, and his luggage was scattered throughout the room, indicating that he had most likely been robbed. Surveillance footage showed Aronson going to the room hours earlier with a man later identified as Jose Manuel Ramirez, a 20-year-old prostitute who went by the nickname The Shadow. Ramirez reportedly turned himself in to law enforcement but denied murdering Aronson during a press conference following his arrest. He admitted to striking the victim twice but blamed the actual killing on a mysterious teenage friend who investigators never mentioned seeing in the security video from the morning of Aronson's death. According to detectives, Ramirez killed Aronson shortly after they went to the hotel room. The accused murderer had a criminal history and had been released from a Mexico City prison just 4 months before Aronson's death. Authorities were hesitant to reveal an alleged motive for the crime and also declined to go into detail about how much money and property was stolen from Aronson's room. The murder received widespread news coverage across the US, yet the story appears to have gone silent after that, leaving the outcome of the case unclear. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear more bizarre and crazy stories, stay tuned after the video for some more content. Number 1. Natila Tucker. In May 2016, 25-year-old Tyron Donovan Jackson was found dead with a bullet wound to the head inside a motel room in Columbia, South Carolina. The employee who discovered his body immediately dialed 911, and responding detectives traced the crime to a 41-year-old prostitute named Natila Tucker, who had fled the scene in the victim's car. At the time of Jackson's death, Tucker was on probation for a drug-related case and had a long list of priors under her belt. Police arrested her 4 days after the incident when they spotted her walking at an intersection. When they searched the accused killer, they found some of Jackson's belongings in her possession. Tucker was charged with murder and possession of a stolen vehicle. According to prosecutors, she shot Jackson during an argument over the cost of her services. 2 years after the tragedy, Tucker pleaded guilty to a lesser involuntary manslaughter charge. She also pleaded guilty to the stolen vehicle count and received consecutive prison sentences totaling 30 years. Tucker will become eligible for parole in 2037 but could remain behind bars until 2041.
9. Rosaling Kio. When Rosaling Kio began working as a stripper at high-end clubs in Manhattan, she was amazed by the amount of money she was making, ranging from $3,000 to $10,000 per night. However, she walked away with just a portion of her earnings after tipping out other staff members and handing over 40% of the club after every shift. Things got even worse after the 2008 recession hit, and customers were no longer dropping big bucks on the dancers. She took a break from the industry, but shortly after her return in 2012, she met Samantha Barbash and Karina Pascucci. The trio conspired to lure men to certain strip clubs where they had an arrangement with the staff. Once there, they served the victim a drug-laced cocktail that caused him to lose awareness of his surroundings without falling unconscious. The women then ran thousands, and sometimes even tens of thousands of dollars worth of charges on the victim's credit card. A lot of men kept silent about the fraud, most likely out of embarrassment and fear of ruining their marriages or jobs. But one customer, Dr. Zayad Yunan, spoke up after being taken for $135,000. He disputed the charges to his card, and when the strip club sued him back for the full amount, he fought back. By then, law enforcement had caught on to the scam and were conducting their own undercover investigation. 4 women were ultimately charged in connection with the crimes. Kio and Barbash received 5 years of probation, and Pascucci was sentenced to 16 weekends in jail. Interestingly, they all took plea deals that spared them from having to pay any of the money back. 8. Georgette Theragood. William Smith's problems were just beginning when security agents found a gun in his bag at Fort Lauderdale Hollywood Airport in 1998. He was put in a federal holding center on a weapons charge, while detectives carried out an intense investigation into his background. This led them to evidence of multiple other crimes, including bank robberies, written plans to hijack a flight to Cuba, and the murder of a 22-year-old exotic dancer named Georgette Theragood. Smith, a known pimp, and Theragood had fled New Mexico with the woman's 1-year-old daughter 2 months earlier in an SUV stolen from the criminal's wife. At the time, Smith was out on bond while awaiting trial for the murder of a rival pimp. Thorogood was last seen alive when the three of them checked into a hotel in Memphis, Tennessee, a few days later. The next day, Smith dropped the baby off at a professional babysitter's home and never returned to pick her up. He abandoned the stolen SUV at a Nashville parking garage, where it was found with bloodstains and a broken windshield from a bullet impact. Shortly before Smith's arrest in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Thorogood's body was discovered in a roadside ditch in Mississippi just south of Memphis. As authorities looked further into the case, they discovered that Smith had a history of crimes dating back to his teenage years. Records showed that he'd used dozens of aliases and at least 10 social security numbers and birth dates. His nearly lifelong crime spree finally came to an end when he was convicted of Thorogood's murder and sentenced to life without parole. 7. Felicia Johnson. In April 2022, 24-year-old Felicia Johnson visited Houston from her hometown of San Diego, California. Hoping to make some money while she was there, she auditioned at a gentleman's club for a job as a dancer. The young woman was last seen getting into a man's car outside the club, and she was never seen or heard from again. Police began investigating the case after Felicia's bloody phone and purse turned up in a local park. They found evidence that she'd gone to the residence of 28-year-old Chukwuebuka Nwabodo. The two had been talking on Snapchat, and he allegedly agreed to pay Felicia $500 for an intimate encounter. Detectives discovered that Nwabodo had recently performed some disturbing Google searches, including "What does beach do to blood?" and "How to get away with murder." He also purchased a saw, trash bags, towels, and a flashlight shortly after her disappearance. Felicia's blood was found in his apartment and car, along with latex gloves, a kitchen knife, and a shovel. Investigators also found photos of what looked like a mutilated woman and 3 other bodies on Nwabodo's phone. They arrested him in connection with Felicia's disappearance, but didn't have enough evidence to hold him at the time, and he was set free. He's been on the run ever since, and Felicia's body has yet to be recovered. 6. Ashley Barrett. 26-year-old Ashley Barrett, an exotic dancer at the VIP Gentleman's Club, was caught handing out business cards for her nearby workplace and offering prostitution services by an employee of the Bottle Cap Lounge in Key West, Florida. According to local officials, when they contacted her employer, she got upset and was arrested for threatening her colleagues with a knife. A few hours later, police received another call about an incident involving Barrett. When they arrived at the scene, 3 of her fellow dancers told officers that the woman was drunk and had swung a hair-straightening iron at them. She allegedly told one dancer that she planned to play an evil game, saying, "I'm going to get you when you least expect it." One of the victims was sleeping when they were attacked. Police arrested Barrett under Florida's Marchman Act, which allows authorities to intervene in certain cases when someone needs help for substance abuse and won't get it on their own. In the end, she was charged with aggravated battery with a deadly weapon. 5. Amber Williamson. After finishing her shift at a strip club in Houston, Texas in 2016, former assistant school principal Amber Williamson barreled into a police car at 90 miles per hour. The 40-year-old was driving on the wrong side of the road in Pearland when she slammed on the brakes less than 2 seconds before the impact, killing rookie officer Andy Equipania. At the time, Amber was out on bail for a drug charge and she was homeless. A few years before the crash, she completed a 2-year probation sentence for a previous DUI case. It's unclear exactly how and why the mother of two's life fell apart in the years leading up to the fatal crash, but it appears as though addiction played a role. Amber's blood alcohol level tested at 0.162, roughly twice the legal limit, and police found a partially consumed bottle of vodka in her car. They ultimately charged her with intoxication manslaughter for the crime. At her trial, the prosecution presented surveillance footage of Amber drinking and allegedly stumbling around at her workplace earlier that night. She was found guilty of the charge and pleaded for leniency at her sentencing, expressing remorse for her actions and asking the judge to spare her from prison time and give her probation. It was wishful thinking for the troubled woman, who received a 32-year prison sentence. 4. Michelle Linahan. 23-year-old Michelle Linahan met a lonely fisherman named Kent LePink in 1994 while working as a dancer at the Great Alaskan Bush Company in Anchorage. They started dating, and she soon quit her job and moved into his house. The couple got engaged, even though LePink was just one of at least 3 men she was involved with throughout their relationship. At one point, another man she had a romantic past with, John Carlin III, moved in with them as a roommate. LePink was shot dead in Hope, Alaska in 1996. Authorities theorized that Linahan and Carlin conspired to murder him in order to benefit from his $1 million life insurance policy, only to learn that LePink had removed Linahan from the policy just days before his death. He'd also written a letter to his parents, telling them that if anything bad happened to him, Linahan, Carlin, or Linahan's third lover Scott Hilk were likely responsible. Although Michelle was visiting Hilk in California at the time of LePink's murder, police suspected that she had masterminded the crime and used her feminine wiles to persuade Carlin to do her dirty work. However, with the lack of evidence tying the suspects to the case, years went by before they were able to make any arrests. Authorities revisited the cold case in 2005 when they interviewed Carlin's son, who was a minor at the time of the murder and had been prevented from talking to police by his dad. He gave information tying his father and Linahan to the murder weapon, along with other damning details. Linahan and Carlin were charged with LePink's murder in 2007. Both their convictions would eventually be overturned, but Carlin died in prison. Many still believe Linahan had something to do with LePink's death, but prosecutors declined to pursue another trial. 3. Lee Grace Doherty. In 2011, 29-year-old Lee Grace Doherty took some time off from her job as a stripper in Cacao Beach, Florida, to go on a week-long crime spree with her brothers, 26-year-old Dylan and 21-year-old Ryan, who was on house arrest at the time. After stealing a car from Ryan's pregnant girlfriend and loading it with guns, the siblings destroyed their cell phones, cut off Ryan's ankle monitoring device and tossed it out the window. On that first day alone, they shot at a cop during a high-speed chase and robbed a bank. News of the crime spree went viral as federal authorities issued a nationwide bulletin about the trio. While Lee Grace quickly became the country's most wanted female fugitive, she also made headlines for some raunchy photos that were leaked to the media. Authorities caught up with the Dohertys in Colorado. A 20-mile high-speed chase ensued as the siblings made a last-ditch effort to evade custody. They eventually ran over some spike traps that were laid out ahead of them, bringing the pursuit to an end. Lee Grace fired shots at an officer during the ordeal and was shot in the leg when he returned fire. The siblings faced dozens of state and federal charges. They were prosecuted in 3 states and each received a 35-year federal prison sentence. 2. Toni Anderson. Toni Anderson's last text message before she disappeared in 2017 was a message to a friend about how she was getting pulled over by police for the 2nd time recently. The 20-year-old Missouri State University student had just finished her shift as an erotic dancer and hostess at a gentleman's club and was on her way to meet a pal. However, she never reached her destination, all communication went dead, and her vehicle was nowhere to be found, leading some to believe that she had been kidnapped. Some speculated that the police might even be involved, since her last known interaction was with an officer. Suspicions were heightened when the Kansas City Police Department denied having any contact with the young woman. It also led to theories that someone posing as a cop had done something horrible to Toni. A spokesperson later came forward and said that they mistakenly denied the encounter because it wasn't logged in their system. After making an illegal lane change, a highway patrol officer issued Toni a verbal warning and directed her to a nearby gas station since she was low on fuel. He watched her pull into the gas station, and that was the last anyone saw of her. Some people believe that Toni was alive and well, and that she'd staged her disappearance as a way to gain money and fame. Unfortunately, they were wrong. Nearly 3 months after she vanished, and after an extensive search of the area failed to turn up any sign of her, Toni's vehicle was pulled from the Missouri River with her body inside. Her death was ruled an accident due to hypothermia and drowning, and the medical examiner determined that alcohol and cocaine were contributing factors. Toni's mother, Lise, criticized the officer who pulled her over for not arresting her for being under the influence. Others have wondered the same thing after seeing body cam footage of Toni acting confused and scattered. In its response, the police department stood by the officer's decision to let Tony go with the warning, saying that he made an appropriate decision based on the information he had at the time. 1. Breenbasarich. In early 2019, a savvy internet user traced some disturbing Tumblr posts about plans to commit a mass shooting to a 31-year-old exotic dancer named Breenbasarich. Posing under the username Taking Lives, she allegedly wrote about how she fantasized about spraying bullets at people with an assault rifle in a crowded public place. The concerned Tumblr user contacted law enforcement in Polk County, Florida. Following an investigation, they charged Basarich with written threat to kill or injure. According to an arrest affidavit, when a fellow Tumblr user asked if her expressions were just fantasies and if she really owned any guns, she replied that she was getting an AR soonish. Shortly after Basarich's arrest, Heavy.com reported that in one post, she expressed her love and support for convicted murderer Dylan Roof. He was responsible for massacring 9 African-American churchgoers in 2015. When commenters expressed shock and outrage, she said that she was well aware of what he'd done and that she adored him. Unfortunately, the outcome of the case is unclear.
Thanks for watching. People tend to look down on the world's oldest profession, but it's never going to go away, whether it's legal or not. In recent years, there's been a growing push to decriminalize prostitution in some places, which could possibly help to make the industry safer for workers. Yet many still believe that tolerating prostitution would only encourage debauchery and hasten the moral decay of a society that's already struggling to maintain respectable values. What's your opinion? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.